Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega and Jamie Soden. And our topic for today is the belief in hell and how people are afraid to question certain beliefs because they think that they have to believe certain things to avoid going to hell. And we think that this could be a big reason why people are not willing to question beliefs such as free will as well. Um, so yeah, and it's interesting because if they understood what it really means, we don't have a free will, they would understand that we can't justly be sent to hell anyway. Even if there's a God, and even if this God was angry at us and wanted to send us to hell, well, that God would have to be insane because God would have to attribute free will and blame us.
Right. So Chandler, yeah, this is important. So not only does the belief in hell sometimes trap people in their religions, because they literally believe this. They believe that when we die, we either go to this wonderful, wonderful place or this horrible place for all of eternity. Can you imagine what it must be like to have that belief? And so, like, the why free will is important is that not only does that belief prevent them from understanding that free will is an illusion because the church says we have free will. They don't want to go against the church in fear of hell. But this belief in free will prevents them from understanding, like you were saying, the complete injustice of God, actually, making us do what we do, and then condemning us to hell for all eternity. So, like, this free will belief is the foundation of so much that is wrong with conventional religion today.
Yes, and one has to wonder, without this belief in free will that we are blameworthy and deserving of suffering, how can one possibly support this belief that we'll be punished? I mean, that's why I like promoting the message of the no free will thing, because it helps people understand that they don't deserve to be sent to hell. And you would think that this would appeal to people because once I understood it, it appealed to me greatly, and it did appeal to me emotionally, I have to admit.
Yeah, and actually, it's not a complete answer because, like, I have to kind of like acknowledge that, for example, we are made to do wrong things in this life. For example, let's say we're made to like not be careful when we walk and we trip. That's kind of like the punishment of not being careful. If we're made to kind of like engage in certain unhealthy behaviors like drinking too much. We might become an alcoholic, and then we're punished for that. So theistically, the argument could be made that, well, God is doing that, in this life already, which seems to be, the case. But I guess, like, it's one thing to have this kind of like limited punishment here, even though we don't have a free will. And it's another thing completely to extend this to the entirety of eternity, the future that just never ends.
Yeah, and that's the problem is, even with free will belief, um, that punishment as retribution, deserving makes sense under the free will perspective, no matter how crazy free will belief is. But, it's still eternal punishment. What could anybody do that makes them deserve to burn forever?
Well, you're right. Just like on its own, like you could do the most heinous thing, you could kill billions of people, and that still wouldn't justify an eternity of hell. Jamie, what are your thoughts on this?
Um, my thoughts on Christians believing in, eternal hell and all this stuff, and saying that some people deserve it, simply for the trivial things such as skepticism or homosexuality, um, which is trivial, by the way. Um, it's kind of hypocritical because they say that they're they're all about tolerance and forgiveness, and they preach that their God is all loving. But how could he be all loving if he tortures people forever?
Jamie, that's a great point. So it's not just the unfairness of making people, do what we do and then punishing us so horribly severely, but it's just the injustice of like, yeah, just like it's such an extreme punishment for things as innocuous sometimes as homosexuality and all. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it gets down into, well, what does loving mean? Because some people will try to make the argument, well, it's the loving thing to burn you forever. There are people like that.
How Yes, that is so insane. That's like Chandler. Yes, we have to kind of figure out, how people, because this is like we're trying to convince people. And so we have to acknowledge that, you know, the conclusions people come up with, like it's loving to condemn somebody to eternal damnation. Oh my God. It's like we have to figure out what is compelling beliefs like that, because it can't be logic or reason. We have to like delve into their emotional makeup and just figure out what are their basic beliefs that justify such completely insane notions. My God.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is that they're told that God sets the standard of what is right and wrong. That's part of the problem. And so if we say that it's wrong that God is unjust to burn people, well, then they say, well, you can, then people actually say this to me. Well, there's no concept of justice without God. God sets what's just. So if God thinks it's just to burn you forever, then it's just. That's the argument I hear.
Right. And I guess that comes down to like, well, where does he say that? He says it in the Bible. How do you know that's the word of God? Well, because it says it in the Bible. So basically, yeah, it's like basically, I guess others can point to religions where God doesn't say that. And so there's a competition of like who's right. And all theists, very ironically, very, mysteriously believe that they have the truth and everyone else is wrong.
I know that's what really blew it for me because here's the deal, because everyone's claiming that they're right and everybody else is wrong. So there's only two possible ways to reason this out. One is that one of these people is right and everybody else on the planet is wrong, or that they're all wrong.
Yeah, yeah, which is a lot more likely. So all right, so let's get back to this. So like, you know, people, I think kids are taught at a very early age, even though they may not be taught the term free will. I think, when they're like 4 or 5 years old, why are you punishing me? Because you did this. And the kid might say, I didn't do this. And yes, you did it, and you're going to be punished because you did it. So I think, this free will belief is indoctrinated in kids at a very early age. And I think the belief in hell is also, again, I think we have to basically recognize that kids, human beings, don't have their reasoning faculties, well developed, I think, until I think maybe at least 10 years old, certainly not by 4 or 5. And so basically, they're at the mercy of whatever their parents tell them. So like this is, I mean, we could make the case that, you know, teaching a young child, 4 or 5 year old, that if they do certain things wrong, they're going to spend the rest of eternity in hell. That to me amounts to like child abuse. But we've got to, you know, I mean, tying it more closely to the belief in free will. Um, I'm not sure, that's going to be a tough one because it's hard enough to convince adults that they should change their perspective on this. I think it's another battle to convince them that they should also change their children's beliefs about this.
Yeah, and part of the problem, George, and this is a massive problem that I've noticed, is that the belief in free will is often used as a reason to not influence people. Because they're like, well, I want my child to make up their own mind what's true or not. Which is, I've heard that, you know what I mean? It's like, well, first of all, there's, they don't decide what's true because truth is truth, so that I always found that a little bit weird. But the problem is that I understand, since everybody is caused to believe what they do, we know it does make a difference what children are taught, and that nobody has a so-called free will or will where it's just them doing something.
Yeah, you're completely right. And that actually, not only does it prevent us, some people will say, well, it doesn't really matter how much we, put into our education system. When kids become adults, they'll pretty much do what they want of their free will. I mean, that's one argument. But that argument actually also applies to the theology. In other words, like if these very, strict, strong theists are teaching their kids basic like moral precepts that are found in the Bible or other religious texts. Part of them is expecting, well, this teaching is going to make a difference, but then they hold this belief that, well, but the kid will still, out of their free will, be able to like either accept them or not or whatever. So it's kind of like a conflicting set of beliefs.
In a way it is, George, because if you believe that your child has a will that can override their entire education, then what's the point of education? You have to wonder.
Yeah. So Jamie, what are your thoughts? What can we do to help these theists, overcome this belief in free will? What I mean, because like they're not completely um, inaccessible to new information. In other words, like we first had Judaism, then that evolved into Christianity, and then Catholicism, experienced the Reformation. So what do they need to hear? What do Protestants maybe need to hear, or Catholics, to to get them to understand that the free will belief first isn't in the Bible, and it's really not necessary to a lot of what their religion is about?
Um, I'm not sure what to suggest, to be honest. I would ask you that to be, because you know more about it
Well,
than I.
interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, this is actually, I think that the answer is, or part of the answer at least, is to get across the message to them that, well, we don't have a free will as human beings. So that must mean, according to their perspective, that we are actually manifesting the will of God. And like I can see, I could see how that would resonate well with them. I've used the example of, like, let's say Obama called us up and said, all right, today you're going to do this, this, whatever, for me, whatever. One would feel, I think, that day was much more significant or dignified, whatever, than the days that we devote just doing whatever we want to do. So I think that rationale may work with them.
It's so weird, George, because I don't feel that way at all about that. Like, I mean, I don't get like, for one thing, I don't view following whichever will you're following, whether that's the will of your parents or or God or the president, like it's not any more noble to be following the will of someone else than anyone else. You know what I'm saying? So it's about what's right, and I think the problem with saying, oh well, we're doing God's will, is, well, then people must wonder, well, God's confused because God's compelling people to do this and compelling other people to work against what he's compelling other people to do. So I'm a little confused there.
Oh, Chandler, yeah, no, and it goes way beyond that. Like, you're right. I mean, basically, that might resonate with some people, but the other thing that's much more difficult is that if what we do isn't up to us because we don't have a free will, and it's up to God, then God is responsible for the Holocaust, for all these genocides, for all this torture of animals. God is responsible for all the evil we do. And we've talked about, in my mind, there's two ways to absolve God. One is to conclude that, while God may be quote unquote all powerful, God can't be infallible, and this evil and pain is kind of like a mistake that God made. And the other, that's perhaps a bit more convincing, is that if God existed eternally, and you can go back in time and there's no time at which he didn't exist, then, this causal regress behind, let's say there's an evil done. So there's a causal regress behind it. It keeps going back in time. And so presumably, it just never gets to a point in the past at which God decided to cause this evil, because obviously there would be time wherein God existed before that. So that's, to my mind, that's the only way we can absolve God of evil. But unfortunately, that also basically um, causes us to not credit him with goodness either, because we can't credit him with at a certain point in the past deciding to do any good.
Yeah, and that's a big problem because people do this flip-flopping where they're like, well, whenever something good happens, well, it's God. Whenever something bad happens, oh, it's our fault. With our free will, we caused this. But what's interesting about it is that if since almost all of them define God as the first cause, the starter of all, the creator of all, that would make God responsible for all good and evil. But like we've been saying, well, for God to make a decision to do something, well, what's the reason for that? And if there's a reason, that reason has a reason, and that reason has a reason. So the infinite regress applies to God as well. So it's almost like there's absolutely a void, a nothing that we can attribute to anything to, because it just keeps going back further and never ends, like you were saying.
Oh yeah, and actually the other problem with God is if we define God as omniscient or all-knowing, then, 1 billion years ago, God knew not only what we would be doing, but what God would be doing, so that like in the present moment, God has no more free will than we do.
Yeah, and I've had the omniscience debate with people, because I've tried to explain to them, well, if God knows what you're going to do, how can you choose to do something different than what God knows you're going to do? And they say, well, God doesn't know what will happen. He just knows all the possibilities. And I'm like, well, that kind of defeats the purpose of all knowing because he doesn't know what's going to happen. So there's things he doesn't know, so he's not omniscient.
Exactly. All right, so yeah, let's return. So basically, this belief in hell, I think is probably the most hateful belief on the planet. For somebody to believe that, another person is so evil as to deserve, after they die to suffer eternally, I can't think of a more hateful belief. So like, again, that is to a great extent determined or dependent on the belief in free will. And, I guess we have to keep pointing out, for example, that free will as a concept is not in the Bible. Certainly in
So
the Bible. Jamie?
let me get this. Let's see if I understand this right. Could this free will belief be part of a reason why people falsely accuse each other?
Well, yes, exactly. In other words, like without the belief in free will, think about it. It would be logical to hold anyone fundamentally accountable for anything.
Yeah, Jamie, I want to respond to what you said there. See, here's the deal. When people are falsely accusing people, well, or truly accusing people, whatever the accusation is, um, it hardly matters because if somebody says that you did something, whether you actually did it or not, it's not your fault. So it's not like they can really accuse you because it's not like you did it, even though it looks to people like you did it because they don't see the cause.
Yeah, they don't look at the causal chain. Um, they just see the person as the first cause of everything.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I think so, like, along with the belief in free will, as being a basis for this, like, very hateful belief in hell, I think the other basis is the whole basic biblical creation story. In other words, like, going by that, there was an Adam and Eve, they did wrong, and we're paying the price. That, that's so kind of like fictionalized that basically anything can be possible. But if we look at the science and establish, like, for example, evil requires pain. If there's no pain, then obviously, in a very real sense, there can be no evil. So like, um, I think life evolved on the planet about 4 billion years ago or so. So, and then like I would imagine when it first evolved, single-celled organisms and, very, very basic organisms, I imagine, all up through the plants, perhaps, hopefully, that these lower quote unquote organisms didn't and don't experience pain or pleasure. So I think it was like with the introduction through evolution of beings, like that can experience pain and pleasure. That's where actually evil came into existence. And so then, like I mean, like if you look into eventually, eventually a comet will hit us, or basically we'll become extinct. It's one way or another. I mean, the universe is going to like exhaust itself in 50 billion years, whatever. So the idea is like, you know, evil will end. It may end with the end of sentient beings that are able to feel pain and pleasure, but that is one way, to kind of like, you know, demonstrate that this construct of an eternal hell is just not necessary. In other words, like if there's no evil, there's no need for, this place of eternal suffering.
Yeah, and it brings it back to the whole point that basically evil is suffering. Like the only reason we label something as evil or bad is because it causes us pain.
Exactly. And actually, well, that's, we can say that, Chandler. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. And of course, we have to consider and address the theological, basically, basis for evil that, like we were talking about before, that evil is simply what God says is evil, regardless, in that sense, maybe regardless of whether it causes pain. It may just simply displease God. But you're right. From a secular, scientific, rational standpoint, you're absolutely right. Evil is what creates pain. Pleasure, happiness is goodness is what creates pleasure and happiness.
Yeah, and it's really kind of strange because I mean, I don't think plants feel pain. I sure hope not anyway, but they don't seem to even have like organs like animals do where it causes major damage if one part malfunctions. Because it does seem like at some point pain had to evolve, I guess, and that is mysterious, that whole thing.
Yeah, and Chandler, that gets back to perhaps we need to see God as fallible. That basically, God is, we can, define God as good, but fallible. And again, even like with the, being all powerful or all knowing, you would think that like all powerful and all knowing would have to mean that God is infallible. And I'm not sure I've completely thought that out, in terms of how that could be reconciled. But that's the only way, again, other than the infinite eternal regress into the past, that we can absolve God of this, mistake of having, created sentient beings through evolution that can experience the pain that creates evil.
Yeah, and George, I think that might appeal to some people, the idea that God makes mistakes, basically. Because that way you don't have to view God as evil necessarily. You just view God as making a mistake. And I mean, I still think the view's incorrect. I mean, um, but it would probably appeal to people more emotionally, might help them understand a few things better. Because we're told that we have to forgive other humans who wrong us. We have to forgive them, that we're fallible, we make mistakes. So if they apply that concept to the God they believe in, that God is fallible, that might work.
Right. And I agree with you. It doesn't, I think we need to kind of like explore it in more depth to see how realistic it is. Because, again, if God is all knowing, you would think that God would know, what the difference between something that would fail or be wrong and something that wouldn't. So, like,
Yeah.
but
And
go
oh,
ahead.
yeah, what I was going to say though is the whole concept of being all knowing is in itself, I think, a paradox. I don't think it could actually be possible, because how in the world would um it's sort of like strange because if God, um, let's just say that God, he has infinite knowledge, so he knows what will happen, but it doesn't happen unless he creates the creatures necessary to make it happen. And so it seems like sort of a really whack thought. I just can't wrap my head around it.
Well, I think it's like, so he knows what will happen, maybe because he knows that he will create those creatures and he knows he will make them do what they do, whatever. Um, but yeah, no, it's like, it's a concept that, we can know the future as human beings to, to a large extent. We predict, we can predict where the planets are going to be at any given day for the next billion years, I would imagine.
Yeah.
We can work things out. So like, so you would think that like an infinitely more intelligent God would have access to all the information and techniques and methods and all that we would. Um,
Yeah.
but again, it's like, but again, if God knows everything, how could be all fallible? And so then we're left with, well, God has to be both good and evil. And, that's our challenge, Chandler. I mean, like, you know, in order to get people to really understand that nothing is up to them, we have to find some way to get them either comfortable with that idea or to present, some kind of theory where God can still remain good.
Yeah, and that's a very difficult one because, and I think it would work with certain people can promote other ideas. And here's the deal is I don't even necessarily think that that like theories like we're coming up with about how to absolve God, I don't really think that, they're true. But some people will end up believing it, and even though that belief might actually be false, it could help them. It's just that I'm just too honest to promote something that I think is false. So that's my difficulty.
Right, and Chandler, I mean, it may be the case that, 1,000 years from now, nobody's going to believe in the biblical or the traditional belief in God. We might believe in a universe that's conscious and, kind of like intelligent in a certain sense, but that would be a very different conception, I think, in many ways from our traditional belief in God. But, I understand your kind of like reluctance or your preference for not promoting something that is not true, like the belief in God. But I think we may need to also address kind of like what might be the lesser of two evils. For example, if free will belief is contributing to this climate change denial that is really, very, very, likely threatening civilization. I mean, my God, then it might be, a pragmatic compromise to just, to meet people where they are, get them to understand this profound truth that free will is an illusion, so they no longer are in denial about climate change. I understand it's a, it's not the ideal, but we may need to kind of have to compromise in a certain sense if we're going to address climate change most quickly.
Yeah, and I totally get that because there are some people that they believe God wants them to be environmentalists and stop pollution and go vegan. I mean, there are those people out there. And I think, well, even though I think that the basis for what they're doing is wrong, they're still doing the right thing. I enjoy that fact.
Absolutely. Chandler, how are we on time?
Let's see, we're almost at 30 minutes. Should I close this one?
Yeah, let's close it and let's hopefully we can get another one in before I have to go. That'd be great.
All right. You've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, George Ortega, and Jamie Soden. We were talking about hell and free will, but we kind of got sidetracked onto the attributes of God and other stuff too. But it was all good talk. We'll see you next time.